Resuming debate, the honourable member for Lakeland.
Thanks, Madam Speaker. It sure is telling that every time the NDP-Liberals get up to talk about this bill, they talk about almost anything other than actually C-50. I think that's because Bill C-50, the Just Transition, is actually the culmination of 9 years of the NDP-Liberals' anti-energy, anti-capitalist, and frankly, anti-Canadian policies that they know will hurt Canadians. The bill's proponents say Bill 50 will deliver jobs and skills training programs, but the bill itself does nothing of the sort. Instead, it sets up a fancy appointed government committee that will set up another committee to dictate 5-year economic plans to governments. And despite what they claim, the costly coalition knows the Just Transition will actually disrupt the livelihoods of millions of Canadians, threaten 2.7 million jobs in energy, agriculture, transportation, construction, and manufacturing, which is about 15% of Canada's total workforce. But don't take my word for it. These numbers come from the Natural Resources Minister's own briefing memo about the Just Transition from a couple of years ago. That's really why the NDP-Liberals colluded to ram Bill C-50 through the House and through committee without hearing from any of the Canadians who they know this bill will affect, because they know just how much harm their so-called Just Transition will cause. In the fall, the cover-up coalition limited debate to less than 8 hours for all parties, allowed only 2 hours for clause-by-clause debate at committee, and ultimately blocked any single witness, anyone, from speaking about the impact of Bill C-50, limited report stage debate to 1 day, and now will only allow less than 6 hours of debate during the third and final reading. This is undemocratic. Obviously, the Liberals know how unpopular the Just Transition actually is among Canadians, and that's exactly why they don't want to let Canadians speak out about it. No wonder they rammed it through committee in the middle of the night, silence everyone, and hope no one notices, because they're actually showing their true colors. They care more about global accolades and international mutual admiration societies than about Canadians. And frankly, they care more than they really care about Canada, about your home, my home, and our home. The Liberals argued that they had to rush through the bill because of how supposedly important it was. But once they sidelined Conservatives and prevented any witnesses from speaking at committee, they didn't bring it back for 4 more months. Time and time again, they say one thing and they do another. Canadians don't want this top-down economic restructuring, wealth redistributing, central planning, Just Transition. That's why they rebranded and changed the name with buzzwords to distract. But Canadians see through them. In fact, the majority of Canadians think Canada should not be forced to pay for or to go through anything like the Just Transition until the world's big polluters make serious efforts of their own. People around the world face energy and food emergencies every day. Countries are switching to coal when Canada should supply them with LNG instead because of these NDP-Liberals. While Canada accounts for only 1.6% of world emissions, China approved more coal power in the first quarter of 2023 after building 6 times as many coal plants as the rest of the world combined in 2022. Last year, over 70% of India's power came from coal. Instead of supporting Canada's LNG development to help countries get off of coal by exporting the world's cleanest LNG, helping to lower global emissions, the Liberals fixate on destroying Canada's economy and the livelihoods of the millions of workers who depend on jobs in Canada's energy sector. How does this make any sense? While the NDP-Liberals punish Canadians for working in one of the world's most sustainable and transparent energy sectors and for living in a cold, distant northern country, other countries burn more and more coal every day. The NDP-Liberals say things like, the world is moving this way. Well, I wish they'd really pay attention to what's actually happening in the rest of the world. The rest of the world's actually moving away from the agenda that the costly coalition imposes on Canada. The virtue signaling and empty words here must stop. Reality and common sense must prevail. No wonder they made that last-minute name change to the bill, launched a coordinated spin job, broke and made up the rules, and rammed it all through so the fewest people would find out. But Conservatives said, not so fast. We proposed reasonable amendments that the NDP-Liberals rejected outright with no hesitation and no consideration. They rejected amendments from Conservatives outlining measures to ensure access to affordable and reliable energy, to ensure a strong export-oriented energy sector, to avoid regulatory duplication and unnecessary delays, measures to improve affordability and to facilitate and promote economic growth in Canada, the creation of sustainable jobs through private sector investment. Measures to ensure that major and clean energy projects under federal regulatory frameworks can be delivered on time and on budget. They rejected that. Measures to ensure the importance of collaborating with all levels of government, including provincial and municipal governments, engaging all relevant partners and stakeholders. Measures to include representatives of provincial governments and Indigenous governance bodies. Measures to recognize local and regional needs, including in Indigenous communities. They rejected measures to ensure ways to create economic opportunities for Indigenous communities. I guess because they know Indigenous Canadians work at double the rates in Canada's oil and gas sector than in other sectors. And measures to ensure this bill promotes economic growth, including the economic growth of Indigenous communities. All of those were proposed by Conservatives and all were rejected by the NDP-Liberals. If you didn't believe before that the just transition would be anything but fair and equitable for Canadians, now you know for sure. What would be the reason for voting against all these changes? Changes calling for measures to improve affordability and to create economic opportunities for Indigenous communities. They even rejected a block amendment because it sought to preserve existing jobs. Bill C-50 won't create sustainable jobs. It will kill them. It's clear there's nothing well-intentioned about this bill or the NDP-Liberals' costly coalition. Conservatives also proposed further amendments for Canadian workers and the energy sector, but the NDP-Liberals opposed them all. Like, quote, Canada's natural resource sector, including oil and gas, has been a reliable source of revenue for the Government of Canada and has contributed to the sustainability of core social programs. Quote, Canada's plan to reduce its production of oil and gas should be done in lockstep with major emitters like China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. Quote, Canada should sell liquefied natural gas to its security partners in Europe so that they can break dependence on Russian natural gas. Quote, Canadian oil and gas workers produce cleaner products than any other country in the world. All were rejected. All of those were rejected by the NDP-Liberals. The costly coalition truly has no regard for the hardworking Canadians in the energy sector and local communities right across the country who keep Canadians' lights on, vehicles running, homes warm and cool, and businesses going. The costly coalition actually ignores the lessons from other countries who began imposing a combination of anti-energy and anti-free market policies years ago. But the NDP-Liberals don't care about reality because it's all about ideology for them. For example, the consequence of Ireland's anti-energy just transition agenda shut down manufacturing jobs in Ireland, only to have the same jobs be created in other countries abroad, with no impact on emissions, but a lot of harm to the economy and the livelihoods of their citizens. Germany was forced to reopen coal plants after initiating their suite of top-down economic restructuring policies years ago. Last year, over a third of Germany's electricity came from coal, and the government waived their emissions tax due to the high cost of energy. Poland is dependent on coal for over 70% of their energy mix, with no plans to phase it out until 2040. The Netherlands was forced to end their cap on energy production from coal-fired power plants to protect themselves and to stop their reliance on Russian natural gas. Austria reopened its coal plants just 2 years after finishing their so-called just transition. And in New Zealand, just 3 years after initiating their just transition plan, the country burned more coal than ever before. Last year, Britain had to bring coal plants back online in the face of cold snaps, with the risk of over 3-hour rolling blackouts, even with the coal plants that were able to come back online, something that Canadians are already experiencing across the country. Sweden, which currently holds the EU's presidency, ceased all of its efforts to net zero and upset EU plans to phase out fossil fuel subsidies earlier this year when it put forward a motion to allow countries to prolong subsidies for coal power plants. Sweden also dumped their 100% renewable target amid ongoing concerns about their own short-term energy security and extended their timelines for alternative energy to 2045. In Scotland, there's no planned phase-out of oil and gas, but rather a commitment to continued exploration and production with the hope that investments in sustainable energy and carbon capture, utilization and storage technologies help reduce sectoral emissions. In Norway, that anti-energy Canadian activists love to celebrate, they continue to export oil and gas, with 49% of Norway's annual revenues coming from the petroleum sector. Warm, small and sunny Mexico also hit record high fossil fuel power generation in 2023. That's the reality around the world where the just transition has been tried. Somehow, the Liberals think if they ignore all of the warning signs and alarm bells, they'll avoid these same problems faced by all of these countries around the world. The Prime Minister and his costly coalition need a serious reality check. But Canadians don't even have to look abroad to see the failure of just transition claims and plans. In 2017, the Liberals accelerated the forced shutdown of coal operations in communities in Alberta, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, which killed the jobs of 3,000 workers across the 4 provinces, approximately 13 communities. The Liberals promised just transition did not materialize. Despite $150 million tax dollars spent, jobs were not replaced, communities were devastated, and municipal representatives worry that local governments will not be able to afford to keep the water running and town services operational much longer. The Auditor General said that Liberals' just transition for coal workers was anything but just. The program lacked employee retention. It actually led to a loss of skills and skilled workers, which hiked the cost of housing and infrastructure in remote areas as people flee those small communities. Impacted workers were not identified in advance, and 86% of the workforce were left behind with generic, untargeted, and unhelpful programs. None of the recommendations of the task force were implemented, and all of the government departments that were supposed to monitor and report on the status of activities and measure whether projects actually helped communities didn't report and couldn't determine whether or not the millions of taxpayer dollars actually did anything. The Liberals' just transition for coal was a perfect and expensive failure trifecta, a failure to plan, a failure to implement, and a failure to measure outcomes. Left behind are dozens of communities and thousands of workers and their families who now have to make new lives for themselves because far away and out-of-touch politicians and program administrators implemented an accelerated plan to fire those hardworking Canadians, make their communities ghost towns, and patted themselves in the back while they're doing it. That's exactly what Bill C-50, the just transition, is all about. They want to do it all again, but this time with energy, agriculture, manufacturing, construction, and transportation workers that rely indirectly or directly on the oil and gas sector. That internal memo to the Natural Resource Minister, it says, quote, large-scale transformations will take place in agriculture for 292,000 workers, in energy for 202,000 workers, in manufacturing for 193,000 workers, in construction for 1.4 million workers, and in transportation for 642,000 workers. And they know it will kill 170,000 oil and gas jobs immediately. That's their plan. The just transition is an attack on all the livelihoods in all those significant sectors in Canada, and it will ultimately hurt all provinces. And what does the minister's memo say these workers will be retained in? Well, some of these people will be retained in jobs as janitors and drivers. Now listen, janitors and drivers are obviously essential workers in any business and in all sectors. But the costly coalition should be honest enough to tell the millions of workers already in sustainable, highly paid jobs with significant pensions, benefits, and advancement opportunities that that's really their plan for them. The just transition is the pinnacle of the NDP-Liberals' anti-energy agenda for Canada. It goes hand in hand with their cruel and inflationary carbon taxes 1 and 2, the tanker ban, the emissions cap, drilling bans, anti-development zones, the unrealistic EV targets, an incoming ban on ICE engines, their overreach on plastics, endless and impossible permitting timelines and red tape, and there are no more pipelines Bill C-69, which was ruled unconstitutional over 185 days ago, with no response or changes yet from the Liberals. This long line of anti-energy policies from the Liberals is a deliberate effort to accelerate the phase-out of oil and gas in Canada. The Liberals know it won't be produced if it can't be exported, so they block pipelines and they turn away world leaders and allies who ask for our resources like LNG. After 9 years, they've already driven billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of jobs out of Canada. It's clearly not worth the cost. At a time when the world is in an energy crisis and millions are living in energy poverty, Canada's resource wealth should be used to support our allies, to support people in developing countries, not force them to support their adversaries. If the just transition in Canada goes ahead as intended, the Liberals will continue to reject allies who so desperately want to get off of Russian energy, to quit funding Putin's war machine. And this is the reality. Global demand for oil and gas has risen and will continue to rise in the foreseeable future. So instead of forcing countries like Japan, Germany, Greece, and others to turn to dictators and despots for their energy needs. Canada should be the reliable and environmentally responsible source they can rely on, but the NDP Liberals gatekeepers hold Canada back. Canada has the 3rd largest oil reserves in the world while being the 4th largest producer, the 18th largest natural gas reserves while being the 5th largest producer. Common sense Conservatives will ensure Canada accelerates and expands the development and exports of traditional oil and gas for the benefit of our people and our home and to help allies around the world. Canada could rank 6th in LNG exports if all of the 18 proposed projects were completed and displace all natural gas from Russia to allied nations in Europe and East Asia like Germany, Ukraine, France, Japan, and South Korea. But this government's regulatory regime has killed all but 3 of those proposed LNG projects in Canada, and still to date, none are operational. Only one, which was previously approved under Conservatives, is under construction. These Liberals also ignore the fact that the oil and gas sector has been and continues to be the top private sector investor in clean technology in Canada. In fact, 75% of Canadian private sector investment in clean energy comes from oil and gas and pipeline companies. But the NDP Liberals will apparently spend billions of tax dollars on re-education programs that their internal briefing notes explicitly say will leave workers at risk of only being able to get jobs that are more precarious with less pay and lower skills requirements, and to shut down a sector that is already the leading research and development investor in skills trainer and alternative, renewable, and future energy technologies in Canada. And by the way, 90% of companies in the oil and gas sector have 100 or fewer employees. They're all small businesses, and they're not big union shops. No matter what they say, the Liberals' just transition won't be able to replace the quality, quantity, or pay of those working today in Canada's energy sector, never mind the tax revenue to all governments that benefit every Canadian. Indigenous people in Canada and visible minorities who are more highly represented in the sectors that Liberals want to transition away from will face even higher job disruptions, more trouble finding new opportunities, and the worst thing is the NDP Liberals know it. Canada should be the world's energy producer and supplier of choice. Canada should be energy secure and self-sufficient. But the Liberals put ideology and partisanship above reality and the economy and Canadian sovereignty. Politicians should be honest about the outcomes of their policies. No wordsmithing can negate the socioeconomic consequences of the just transition concept for Canada. And besides, Canadian oil and gas jobs, they are sustainable jobs. The solutions are transformation, not transition. Technology, not taxes, led by the private sector, not government. Conservatives would bring costs and red tape down, accelerate approvals to make both traditional and alternative energy more affordable and accessible for all Canadians while greenlighting green projects to help lower emissions globally. But I believe Canadians can see through the costly coalition. I believe they know they're not worth their trust and not worth the cost to Canada. For my part, I won't stop speaking the truth, no matter what vile names or crass insults they throw at me, no matter how much doublespeak and gaslighting they do. I won't back down and I won't cower. The truth is this: common sense Conservatives are the only party that wants to make life more affordable for all Canadians, and to green-light green projects and expand traditional oil and gas for Canadian energy self-sufficiency, to protect Canada's sovereignty, enhance Canada's security with free and democratic allies, and to help lower emissions globally. The best thing for workers right across the country are jobs. This bill creates a fancy government committee that will create another fancy government committee, all behind closed doors, with no transparency, no accountability to deliver plans to restructure Canada's economy on a 5-year cycle. This is exactly the kind of anti-energy, anti-private sector, anti-democratic policy agenda that has led other countries around the world into expensive power, unaffordable and unreliable fuel and power, protests from their citizens, and governments rolling back these suites of bad policies that are harmful to their countries and harmful to the people. And this also, given Iran's attack on Israel, Canadians should also be thinking about the necessity for Canada to be completely self-sufficient for our own energy supply and security, which is what Conservatives will ensure we can be under a new common sense Conservative government. So, Madam Speaker, I would like to move the following amendment, seconded by the member from Provencher, that the motion be amended by deleting all the words after the word that and substituting the following. The House decline to give third reading to Bill C-50, an act respecting accountability, transparency, and engagement to support the creation of sustainable jobs for workers and economic growth in a net zero economy, since the bill will actually displace workers, kill jobs, and kill the very sector that provides the most investment and the most advancements in alternative energy. Thanks, Madam Speaker.